Hey guys, how's it going? Valk here. Today I have for you guys the guide for the tank down draft. Tank down is a playstyle that is defined solely by how safe it is. Usually favored by Korean players, tank down can be characterized by risk minimization. While cleave and aggro comps look to go fast and go, fast and fun. Tank down games usually last until at least mid-frenzy, where their carries can outpace the opponent's carries due to elemental advantage, or in cases like drafting Seaside Bologna into units that are vulnerable to AoE. If you want to see this playstyle in action, feel free to check out streamers like Car6 or multiple legend finisher Magic Chi. Both of these guys play slow and steady style that I think are great examples to learn from. The pros of tank down is characterized by its safety. They have good matchups, good win rate, but really long match times. If you are afraid of losing, you don't really want to press play, right? Having the units to play this style will make you feel really safe. I would also say it doesn't require insane gear, especially if it doesn't need any speed gear, nor does it need insane damage gear. The goal of the comp is to draft so safe you can easily win, regardless of whether or not you're gearing. This style can also be difficult to cleave, since normally cleave really thrives during the season off of quick matches, and it really punishes other aggressive drafts that are slower than itself. The safe opening picks of a tank down draft makes it very difficult to figure out what units to correctly cleave into them with. Now I would say the #1 con of playing a tank down draft is you'll often have very slow games that could lead to some really bland gameplay and long matches. So losing one into late frenzy will usually feel really bad. Now while tank down doesn't require you to have a lot of heroes, it does involve a lot of limited or specific moonlight heroes such as Mediator Kowarik, Rimuru, Seaside Bologna, Archdemon Shadow, and AOL, for example, Conqueror Lilius as well. These are all common units that are, I would say, must-haves for this playstyle. Otherwise, you would need way more units just to mitigate the lack of having these heroes. Tank down games also last a lot longer, which means having a stronger game sense and strong decision-making is vital to this playstyle. Sometimes holding a skill's cooldown or saving souls for a later soul burn to enable a clutch play is all you really need to pull out a win. So I would definitely say, because you have to take more turns and make more decisions, it's definitely a higher skill cap playstyles compared to a lot of other playstyles. Looking at some drafts, we can see that tank down's biggest strength lies in the fact that not only can you take away the best supports in the game, but some of these support units are also the most annoying debuff units in the game, like Angel of Light and Conqueror Lilius. After the Adventurer Ras buff, this style definitely got a lot stronger due to all the opening units having both offensive and defensive utilities, which means as long as you know how to pick the correct DPS units into good matchups on pick 4 and 5, your supports can usually carry most of the game. Now, one thing you'll notice is that the opening picks in this draft style will usually contain units that have both offensive and defensive tools. So regardless of who gets picked or banned, you have a two-way support for your entire team. See Lilius, for example, can reduce buff duration, give team Vigor buff, which is 30% attack and defense, redirect, provoke, and barrier, and pulse the ally on a dual attack. On top of that, she can attack down the enemy, so she just brings a lot of tools that enable your team two ways, right? Offensively and defensively. Mediator Kowarik's another insane example. He can cleanse, provide immunity, attack up, while also stripping buffs and attack down on his S2. On top of that, he also gives a barrier, which really stops a lot of aggression because it scales with his health now. With high HP, he can really wall off a lot of aggression. And he can CR push with S1, so if you're ever short 15 CR on another unit to make a big play, he can mitigate those as well. Adventurer Ross, in a similar vein, has a very defensive S3 where he can heal and provide AoE defense buff. His S2 is where he gets aggressive, since it has a pretty good chance of landing a defense break and pulls a dual attack from the highest attack ally. S1's just a humble strip, but after his buff, the most important change came from his Solitude rune in his skill tree, which now gives a barrier to his back row ally, and it just gives him overall a lot of utility to play against aggression. Another common pick when C. Lilius is banned is Angel of Light. She can steal away valuable buffs that your opponent might want to use to play aggressively and apply unbuffable. So it puts a lot of pressure on your opponent to start cleansing, because unbuffable cripples a lot of units like Solitaria, Landy, Operator Sigrid, and Alencia. If your opponent tries to play AoE at all, she can provide a layer of skill nullifier for defense. Her S1 can silence and push back, which is very disruptive and denies aggression. On top of all of that, she's a mage, which means if necessary, she can also carry a book and enable aggressive drafts as well. Tank or bruiser Politis is something I see a lot from this comp, since the threat of the S2 with like, let's say a Sierra Wren or an Abyssal Crown can deny a lot of popular standard or even aggressive drafts featuring Amelia or Diane. On top of that, her S3 lets her proactively apply Unbuffable and Blind, so if your opponent is trying to play Amelia or Diane into those and they want to cleanse, now you have a chance to apply debuffs again. Normally, players try to kill her before activating their Soul Weavers, but if she's put on counter set, units that have no buffs or are unbuffable can just randomly get stunned, and it stalls out aggression quite a bit. Fallen Cecilia and Crimson Armin are too nice to fall back on when A. Ross isn't available, although both of those units I would say are more focused defensively than offensively, and they don't have too many disrupting utilities outside of their S1 provoke, so they stand as okay options to play purely defensive, and they don't really enable your team offensively as much as Adventurer Ross does. Now, when Hand Guy isn't available, I actually see this draft use a lot of Mate Chloe over options like DN. While DN is more flexible for aggressive and faster drafts, I think Mate Chloe has buffs that enable slower composition better, and her passive is just better for tankier and slower teams. On top of that, I think a slower, tankier, and higher effective resistance Amelia can kind of do a similar line of work. Ruel is also another big support for this style, as she can go a long way to deny the cooldown of single target nukers with her 1-to-1 revive, right? So how I think about it is, you know, any unit that is single target nuked, right? Whatever is the highest kill priority unit, Ruel, because she can revive those units that just got nuked 1-for-1, she essentially trades a cooldown for, like, let's say a Hwayoung cooldown or a Rimuru cooldown, and she becomes a +1 to the kill priority on top of those units. And I would say this is favored heavily by Korean players, especially following the Korean player known as Sixduck. He's very infamous for early picking Ruels and just playing a very slow game. Very patient playstyle, I would say. As far as DPS units goes, this is where Tank Down is very, very open-ended. While you need the best supports in any given meta to play Tank Down, I think having a good variety of DPS to kind of fill different slots and knowing when to pick them is very, very valuable. Archdemon Shadow is probably the most common pick for when you have a Mediator and Adventurer Ross ready. Her biggest counters are already on your team, and a Ross S2, especially when you Soulburn, can just let her really pop off. Seaside Bologna is another pick I see a lot and has great matchups into teams that can give immunity, but specifically Spectre Tenebria. Lionheart Sirmia is a pick that is usually favored earlier by Korean players, more situational by global players, but understandably so, since you're slowing down the match time, and in a longer match, there are so many counter and extra attack units in the game, and especially if the game drags on long, somebody's bound to dual attack you, and once that dual attack happens, boom, it's kind of over. Andy and Spectre Tenebria are normally more picked versus Tank Down, but in a game they make it through. I think they're also very valuable carries to have, since Landy and Spectre Tenny on 4-5 usually forces a ban in the correct drafts. Overall, DPS units outside of Archdemon is entirely situational, and playing the game to get more experience helps learn the game a whole bunch. And I would say playing the game a whole bunch and as much as you can definitely helps you learn and figure out what DPS fits your playstyle the best. And this goes for any playstyle, not just Tank Down. Now you may ask, right, why not Hwayoung, right? She's a really strong DPS, why is she not included in these drafts? That unit's kind of OP. Well, that's because Tank Down players normally have Hwayoung pre-banned permanently. This is one of the most consistent pre-bans for all players of the genre, I would say. Outside of that, other common pre-bans include anything that can block out cleaves, specifically Ran. Rimuru, who can nuke very aggressively, is another common pre-ban. I've seen Peyra a lot too, since she can also enable some cleave, especially if you don't have a good DJB prepared. Another one that I've seen pre-ban sometimes is DN, since she can help players flex into aggro, standard, or cleave, right? It makes defending against the DN a lot more ambiguous. Essentially, anything that can speed up the game's tempo should be banned out. And that's something you should experiment with for yourself, because Everybody is going to have a different experience, but essentially the whole point of this pre-ban is to make sure the game doesn't end in 1 turn, doesn't end in 2 turns, doesn't end in 3 turns, doesn't end in 4 turns, but the game ends when you want it to end. And that's the whole point of a tank down. It's a little bit of a stall comp. Now, to get a better sense of how this normally plays out, here's some sample games. Since I normally don't play this style, most of these drafts are going to be right side perspective or from a friend's perspective. Note that almost all of the units' opening picks are relatively neutral to good in terms of matchup, and when the opponent commits to a playstyle, then the 2 DPS units are committed by the tank down player. So with this first draft, Charfade, who's kind of known in community, picks Mediator Choleric first, which stops a lot of crowd control and gives attack up and immunity to his team. My picks here are pretty standard for me. Spectenny plus Amelia, very aggressive and standard, and flexible enough to play 2 to 3 different playstyles. And this is where the tank down happens, on his 2-3. Angel of Light lets him strip my aggressive buffs, and the silence holds my cooldowns, and it protects him from AoEs that I might be planning on drafting. So, you know, while I was thinking about drafting Landy versus Mediator Choleric giving 8 buffs, now that's no longer an option. While FCC can protect his units from burst damage, and her disruptive utility would be in being able to chain provoke low res slower units. So noticing that my opponent's trying to slow down the game's pace, I take 2 cleanse options to fight the AOL. Now this is a very important rotation for my opponent since he takes Landy and Archdemon. One is a super high tempo carry and the other one is a mid tempo carry. I have pretty good options to deal with the Archdemon, but I don't really have good options to deal with the Landy. So at this point in my mind, I need to draft a good last pick, and I need to figure out if my comp is better if I ban Landy or AOL. And I would definitely say this is where my draft isn't as cohesive as I like to be, because of how defensive his team comp is. I had a really hard time finding a good carry that fits in this last spot. In the end, the draft kind of ends in a 50-50. Because Operator Sigrid is really strong to FCC. So if he bans Destina, I almost certainly have to ban the AOL. If he bans Operator Sigrid, I have to ban the Landy because my team would be lacking damage and tempo. And because I already sank so much resources into drafting these cleansers, I definitely should have banned the Landy, but in here, I banned the AOL thinking he was going to ban my Destina, but he bans my Opsig instead, and I just get out-tempoed by the Landy, and I lose. So that's definitely a strength of Tank Down. It just has so many disruptive ways to control the enemy's draft while having defensive tools to prop up their own draft. And that's especially after the A Ross buff. This playstyle definitely got a lot stronger. Now this next draft is one from multiple legend finisher Magic Chi. He's been using a variation of this draft for many seasons at the highest level. As is, the draft is all about drafting flexible utility in the game from his first pick to his third picks. Both players kind of start with 1 tank plus a support, right? Chi starts with 2 supports plus 1 tank, and now Sixduck has to commit his carries. So Sixduck commits Lionheart and Designer Lullaby, right? 2 units kind of designed to pincer Conqueror Lilius. Now, this is where Chi can swing things into his advantage, because with his 2 DPS carries, he picks Remnant Violet and Archdemon Shadow. Both of his carries can fight both of the opponent's carries and can fight through their supports. And this is why getting C Lilius and Mediator Choleric and A Ross is so important, because these units, right? Remnant Violet and Archdemon Shadow are usually threatened by the support's offensive utilities, right? And defensive utilities as well. C Lilius can strip the evasion off of the Remnant Violet. Mediator Choleric can provide immunity against Archdemon Shadow's seal and defense breaks and burns. Obviously, Adventurer Ross is really good both against and with both carries. So taking these 3 away to enable both of these last 2 pick carries is supremely important. And Sixduck doesn't have the same options because all he has for his units are the defensive utilities. So Chi ends up with a really good draft into the top 4. And this is a fundamental of playing competitive RTA. We call this playing the top 4, which any combination of your 5 units can beat the top 4 units of your opponent's team. So regardless of what they pick last, you've already won your draft. But if your opponent's last pick is particularly weak, you can ban another stronger unit. So in Chi's draft here, either one of his DPS can easily fight against Sixduck's top 4 units, so regardless of which support or another carry or a controller is picked last, it's just going to be banned. So while I don't draft tank down all the time, I do have to opt for sometimes when my opponent opens the game kind of in a very slow, safe way, so I can match their tempo and then try to swing it on them. But when I do open the draft this way, I tend to try to find very aggressive ways to swing out of the draft, as aggressively as I can, in fact. So if you open defensively, drafting well can let you swing it offensively as well. So in this draft, my opponent goes for Mediator, which immediately signals to me that he's going to play tank down. It's very difficult to draft pure aggro into tank down because you kind of telegraph a lot of ways that you want to attack them, and that lets them defend appropriately. So what I do here is I try to draft as neutral as I can, right? Amelia to match the Mediator Choleric, and A Ross to essentially take away the best tank here. Now he respawns with a good package of very high tempo carries, some of the best I would even say. And now my picks here are Alencia and Huayang. Alencia has a really good matchup versus Landy, and I think Huayang with attack buff has an incredibly good matchup versus Mediator Choleric. Neither one of my picks is particularly good into Spectre Tenebria here, so if my opponent played off of that, I think he would have had a better draft. But because my third and fourth pick are relatively neutral here, he had to opt into FCC and Ruel on his 4-5, so he kind of forms a very standard slash defensive type of draft. Now that I see this, right, and this is kind of how you would play a tank down slash standard as a second pick, I try to identify what unit is best banned to remove the most support from his team, right? So if he's lacking damage, I ban his best damage dealer and I play slow. If he's, lacking survivability, maybe I ban his mitigator and I try to just kill him fast. I notice, he has two relatively squishy carries with one single target reviver and a mitigator. My game plan is suddenly, let's pivot this aggressive. I'm gonna ban his mitigator and take an AoE unit last. So in this particular game, Amelia pulls Alencia, strips the Landy out of stealth, and kind of does solid damage to both the Landy and Spectre Tenebria. Fire Choleric presses S3, I can rip both of these units out of life, and now Adventurer Ross can just S2 Mediator Choleric. With only Ruel left, he has to pick a unit to revive, right? And basically, whatever unit he revives, I can kind of just kill the Ruel and slowly tempo him down. But either way, regardless of what my opponent bans, right? I am guaranteed to keep either Huayang or Fire Choleric. And in either one of those cases, I think I had a really good leg up on my opponent just from being aggressive. Again, my opening is very defensive, but I'm no longer a very good defensive player. I don't think I have the patience for a longer game. So for me, even if I have to open the draft defensively, I will try to swing it as aggressively as I can. And that's kind of my personal take on this playstyle. As you guys can see, even a super defensive opening can be pivoted in multiple ways, including aggressively. All that matters is you have the tools to deal with your opponent's draft, and as each season draws to a close, there will be less and less cleave and aggro just due to the point volatility of these playstyles, right? More things can go wrong all of a sudden just because these playstyles have less tools to stabilize with. So more players will be opting to go slow and steady with this type of tank down, very safe type of comp, swinging aggressively occasionally as the situation calls for it. I would recommend anybody pushing for Emperor or Legend to at least familiarize themselves with this playstyle and its counterplay units, since this playstyle will be a huge portion of the high-end competitive ladder come last week. With that being said though, this will be the video from me today. If you guys found this video helpful, please leave me a like and subscribe as it will help me out a lot. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'll try to answer as many of them as I can. If you were looking for a guide to a more fast-paced playstyle, I should be leaving one up on screen sometimes right about now. For now though, that'll be the video from me. Hope you guys have a great one, and I'll see you guys in the next video. See ya.